welcome, rock and roll rebels, to another episode of Ramble On with Rosie. That being me, your host Rosie, and do I have some pretty rad and spectacular news for you today? For once, on a very rare occasion, I get to discuss new music versus music that's been around for a very long time, or new music from bands that have been around for a very long time. The Killers, probably the only modern band that I really enjoy, the springboard for a lot of this because it was their collaboration with Bruce Springsteen that I talked about on the air, where Dave Marsh encouraged my skills as a rock critic, which gave me the confidence boost I needed to bring you the show that you have today. So, I'm a big Killers fan, and have been since forever, my teens, ever since I knew about them, ever since it was, somebody told me, and, down the same street that I lived, Smile Like You Mean It, that's the name of the song, so way back in the day, when I had those on a mixtape CD that my brother had made me, I've been a Killers fan. So when they drop a new album, y'all will hear about it from me, and that's what's going to happen today. If you don't know the Killers, stick around and you'll learn some. And if you do and you enjoy them, also stick around. And if you don't, you may enjoy this album when you haven't enjoyed their previous stuff. It is a very unusual album. It's got aspects of things they've covered in their previous works, but it's unlike anything they've ever done. It's gorgeous and haunting, and not necessarily just your fist-pumping rager arena rock that you would come to expect from Brandon Flowers and company. It has been described as a concept album, and I can't say I can totally argue with that. Like I said, I normally think of concepts albums as things like Pink Floyd and the Moody Blues, where they sort of streamline together, and if you hear one track, you want to listen to the rest of the album. And they're sort of like a symphony. But if you're going about a concept album being, it shares the same concept, then absolutely. The album is a exploration of Brandon Flowers' hometown of Nephi, Utah, where he spent a decent amount of his adolescence. And this album will punch you in the guts and leave you breathless and everything in between. It's gorgeous, and very evocative. And so, without using any more extra superlative adjectives, I will get into the nuts and bolts of the album and break down the songs and what I liked best about them, and some general stuff about the Killers too, in there probably too, having been a fan of them for a while. So, to me, Pressure Machine, this latest album by the Killers, really it takes aspects of all of their, things that they have covered in other songs lyrically, and it puts them under a microscope and slows everything down. So it's a slow-mo zoom in on things like drug issues and, failing relationships and all these real-life daily grind struggles, or national issues that they have touched on before, but now it's in a specific context, in a specific location, with individuals, rather than just hey. So it's sort of like Uncle Johnny from Sam's Town, but slowed down and put under a microscope. It's kind of closest thing I can compare it to, because it's really not like anything they've ever done before. It's like Sam's Town slowed down by 10 and put under a magnification. And so, in spite of, things that people have said were good or bad about it, I really enjoy seeing an artist go in a new direction and explore that. And that's happened in the past, and bands have gotten heat for it. Like, when Led Zeppelin did Led Zeppelin 3, everybody was like, oh my gosh, this isn't them, this is horrible. The critics shredded that album, and it's my favorite Led Zeppelin album. So, doing something new is a bold and brave move. Doing a concept album in the 21st century is pretty rad. And I commend them for the courage to take their own musical direction. it was very much birthed from what I've read out of being stuck in quarantine and the having to basically postpone the Imploding the Mirage tour that they were going to do because of the pandemic. They had to, put that off. And so they had all this time, and it gave Brandon Flowers, the predominant songwriter for the band and frontman, the time to, sit back and re-examine, which I don't know about y'all, I did a lot of soul-searching and re-examining last year because I didn't have a whole heck of a lot else to do. And it would seem Mr. Flowers was doing the same. And that's what this album came out of, because they had considered doing an album just out of, leftovers from Imploding the Mirage album, which was their previous album, and then they're like, Brandon's like, hey, I've got this idea, y'all want to go with me on it? And they're like, okay. Oh, Captain, my Captain, we'll go where you're going. And they did. Brandon wrote all of the lyrics before he wrote any of the music, which is pretty impressive and unusual in a way, I would think, to write all of the album's lyrics before you start writing any music. So that was interesting and fun to find out. I would love to have known what that would have been like to do and how you ended up piecing up the music, because this is the most musically complex the Killers have ever gotten. There is mandolin, there is cello, there's violin, there is harmonica, there is steel guitar. It's not just your usual rock band and synth sound that the Killers are most known for. In fact, there's only a couple songs that I can really think of on it that are synth heavy, like Killers usually are, where the synth is, one of the most predominant instruments, unless there's a guitar solo. The synth goes into the background on most of these songs, not the forefront. And it's lovely to see a modern artist doing, using actual instruments, and not just actual instruments aside, from guitar, bass, and drums. So like I said, you've got all sorts of strings on this album, and the harmonica shows up in some very subtle and unexpected places where you're like, you have to listen to the song 5 times, you're like, oh, there's harmonica on this song, and I missed that. So it's really good. There is, obviously, due to their vocal admiration of Bruce Springsteen and the recent collaboration earlier this year with them doing a redo of Dustland, which honestly, that redo of Dustland with Bruce Springsteen was like a teaser trailer for this album, because that was also heavier on the strings and, that delicate haunting sound compared to the original version of Dustland Fairy Tale off of Day and Age. It was way different than their original album version, and it was very much in the direction that this Pressure Machine album has went compared to their previous work. So, and while I will draw some comparisons to Springsteen, that is in no way to undermine their writing. It is simply a point of reference and context, because they are all their own and all original. And yes, they're inspired by those who came before them, but who hasn't? I mean, the entire British invasion was British musicians inspired by the American blues. So everybody borrows from draws inspiration from their predecessors, and the Killers are no different. And in spite of all the many Springsteen comparisons that have come out of this one, because everybody wants to be like, oh my gosh, this is the Killers doing Nebraska. Which I understand that. I had that first thought, simply because you like to... I think Bruce even said this when he was getting compared to Bob Dylan in the 70s. He's like, people want to compare you to what they know, their nearest frame of reference. And that's what's happening here, is Brandon Flowers is now getting compared to Springsteen versus Springsteen getting compared to Dylan. But they're not the same. Just like Springsteen is in no way, Bob Dylan, the Killers are in no way Bruce Springsteen. They're different and new and excellent in their own way. And that is the truth. And also, I will have a slight counterpoint, because while they delve into similar topics as Bruce does, the Killers songs aren't always hopeful. That is something that's almost universal in Bruce's songs, is no matter the plight of his characters, there's usually an aspect of hope to the song, or perseverance, and sometimes you don't know where the characters in a Killer song are going. You don't know if they're gonna be on that hill because they can't stop, or if they're just sort of stuck where they were left in the song, or going in a downhill direction. So, with that, out of the way, I will dive into the songs. The first track. Oh, and incidentally, not every track, but most of the tracks have a spoken word, bits of interview from people from Nephi, Utah, interspersed between the songs. And they're sharing, their thoughts on the opioid crisis, remembrances from rodeos, all sorts of just everyday life in a small town stuff, why they stayed there in the town that they live in, how they met, their spouse there, all those things, the fact it's a good place to raise kids, but also countering that with the man who's interviewed in one of the snippets, who's talking about how his brother moved into the community and they tried to tape him to the flagpole at the high school because he didn't fit in. Like, it's the dark and the light of small town living beautifully put on display in this album. So, that said, shall we dig in? West Hills is... The vocals on it are probably the most standout, best... Like, if I had to pick out of all the songs on the album, the ones where Brandon's voice is at its absolute, just most stunning, beautiful best, in the dramatic way that he can use his voice, West Hills is definitely up there. It's a haunting song covering the use of opiates in small towns, as well as, it's complex. Like most Killer songs, especially the ones that aren't just Major Rager, and even some of the Major Rager ones, they are complex. They are what you need to hear at the time. Like, 10 different people could listen to the song and tell you 10 different things as to what it was about. Like, on the surface, yes, it's about this dude and the girl that he meets and, getting possession of them hillbilly heroin pills. But there's everything else in the song is entirely up in the air to the interpretation of the listener, which that's one of the beautiful things in Brandon's songwriting, is it's whatever you need to hear at the time, and however you need to apply it to your own life. So it's universal, and there's some gorgeous mandolin in the song. I looked it up online, the Wikipedia at least. We know how reliable they are. Didn't credit anybody for playing mandolin on the first track on the album, but I'm pretty sure there's mandolin in this particular track. It doesn't sound like anything other than a mandolin, unless it's some sort of weird guitar I don't know about. And the mandolin use on this song is phenomenal. I love it. It's beautiful. It adds to the haunting effect. And there's very, evocative, plaintive harmonica in the background. Like I said, the harmonica shows up in some unexpected places where you don't necessarily hear it prominently. And it's sort of it's got a little bit thematically in common with Uncle Johnny from Sam's Town, but, simply people involved in substance abuse and, the effects on their life. And it's a really good song. Like I said, it's Brandon's standout vocal performance on this album, in my opinion at least. The second song on the album is the best song, if you ask me. It certainly had the most impact on me. It's called Quiet Town, and not only does it very beautifully and perfectly summarize what it's like to live in a small town. Like, I grew up in a town where, to quote the song, people still don't deadbolt their doors at night. Like, I lived there. Nobody locked their car or their door. It's still kind of like that. I mean, I'm about 30 miles from that town now. And I actually went and visited yesterday because the song, because of this album, it didn't just make me nostalgic for where I went to high school and junior high. It made me reconsider some other aspects, because the other aspect in Quiet Town, aside from being about a small town, is it's about a couple in high school that Brandon knew who died in a train accident. They got hit by the train, somewhat suspicious as it was possibly suicidal, not just accidental. and the aftermath of that, you know, losing people you went to school with. And also, it's partly about, you know, the rise in drug use in the high school age kids in this town. Excuse me. And all that culminates in like a triple hit on me, because one of the people I went to high school with did in fact overdose on drugs and die, and I still don't quite know if it was accidental or intentional overdose. I had moved away by that time. It was his senior year. And, you know, it's one of those questions you can't just ask people. Like, did he commit suicide or was it accidental? Like, it's not a question you can ask to people who would know the answer to, because it's too close of an issue for them. At least I don't feel comfortable doing that. And so part of the reason I had to go take a road trip was nostalgia brought on by this album, but also to go find my classmate's grave and pay my respects, because this whole song just made me think about that incident so strongly. Which proves, you know, the power of music to, like, pull up things that you hadn't thought about in a long time. And, you know, make you feel the emotions that you may have not otherwise, you know, wanted to feel. Or, you know, given the proper attention to that they needed. So Quiet Town impacted me hugely, and it's one of the best songs on the album. Aside from that, at least I think so. I may be prejudiced because it had such an impact on me. But, I mean, there's beautiful, tragic imagery about, you know, I think the line is, I can't remember if it's the sons and daughters or boys and girls laying there lifeless in their suits and gowns, which counterposes, you know, how high school kids should be. They should be alive in their suits and gowns at prom and at graduation, not dead from overdose. And so that's a really tough line to tackle with and deal. And so Quiet Town is definitely an impactful song, especially if you've lived in a small town or lost people to, you know, opioids or suicide. So yeah, this isn't a lighthearted album. We'll put it that way. It's got some really dark issues covered in it. Like in the next song, Terrible Thing, it's from the perspective of a homosexual boy living in a small town, but that was the perspective it was written in. But it's relatable if you've ever been really down and contemplating taking your own life, especially in a small town, because you don't fit in, whether it is because you are gay or because you're the outsider, you're the kid that gets bullied for whatever reason. I mean, it's high school and junior high. Who knows why kids get bullied versus other kids not getting bullied? It's a crazy, weird world when you're in your teens. Whoever thought it was a good idea to put a bunch of teenagers in the same room together and call it education might have needed to rethink some things. But, that being the case, Terrible Thing is beautifully haunting. Again, it's very delicate guitar work going on in the song, and it's lonesome. It fits the feel of the song so well. I think, I'm trying to remember, I want to say, yeah, there are subtle hints of harmonica. Again, it's very subtle in this song. Like, you could listen to the song 10 times, and if somebody didn't tell you there was harmonica in it, you might not notice it. But it fits that lonesome feel that it feels like when you're the outcast, the outsider, the misfit who doesn't quite fit in to the small town world for whatever reason that may be. And on the same topic, you get the counter voice. You like Terrible Thing. You have the high school kid who's contemplating taking his own life because he doesn't fit in. And the next song, Cody, you have the kid who's acting out because he's a different kind of kid, to quote the song. So rather than, you know, taking it and internalizing it, he's, you know, being rebellious and setting stuff on fire. And I think we've known this kid. Most of us who went to high school knew a kid that was sort of like that kid. Maybe not to that dramatic of an extent, but you knew the kid who was always into shit because he was acting out, you know, rebelling, didn't like the situation, didn't like who he was, whatever it was. And that's this song, and it has a much more rebellious element. Like, there's some really cool, very distorted guitar, and Brandon's voice mixes in with the instruments really well. Like, this is probably the best use of Brandon's voice as an instrument to fit in with the rest of the melody versus a standout, like, solo part of the arrangement on its own. It fits with the instrumentation of the song, and there's a kick-ass guitar solo. I am a huge fan of guitar solos, and they're so rare in modern songs that I'm like, gimme. Whenever I hear one, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a guitar solo! This doesn't happen that much in modern music, especially when it's like a distorted kind of guitar solo or a bluesy sounding one. Like, I get, you know, metal has their guitar solos, but it's a guitar solo as part of a song, not the whole song is a guitar solo. The only time that's acceptable is when it's Dazed and Confused by Led Zeppelin. But it's got a really good guitar solo, even if it is short. It's not the 1970s anymore, sadly. I don't get 5-minute guitar solos. And the world is a sadder place for not having 5-minute guitar solos. And the next song is Sleepwalker, which, I'm a huge fan of the amount of mandolin in this song. Like, can't tell I'm big on mandolin. I don't know, maybe it's the Rod Stewart fan in me, but I'm like, the mandolin belongs in rock, and thank you to the Killers for remembering that. Do not underestimate the power of a mandolin. Don't believe me, just go watch that scene from El Dorado where he's viciously playing guitar at somebody. Or mandolin, whichever it is. It's some sort of stringed instrument. It's the size of a mandolin. I want it to be a mandolin. Anyways, there's excellent use of mandolin on Sleepwalker, and it's got some very descriptive imagery of, like, life out west in the desert. I mean, I spent a decent amount of my childhood in Arizona, and some people consider Texas the West. I do not live in West Texas, I live in Central Texas. So I beg to differ. We're like 3 different parts of the country. We're part plains, part Southwest, and part South. Most Texans, however, identify as being Southerners, so we strongly adhere to being the South. Even though people in Georgia and even some other states in the South are like, Texas isn't the South. We're like, yes, we are, you snobs. But regional disputes aside, a desert kid, you know, anybody who's lived out west or seen out west can relate to a lot of, like, they've seen the imagery, the way it's being described in this song about the scenery, about, you know, the hillsides. Like, you know, how things just liven up overnight. Like, if you've ever been around when the cacti bloom in Arizona, it's a quick, beautiful interlude that does not last very long, but it's stunning when it does. And so the visual imagery is great. It's one of probably the most upbeat song on the album, which is interesting for a song called Sleepwalker. You'd expect to be more down. And it does have a bit of the philosophy, its philosophical side to it about, you know, how people deal with their fears. But mostly it's just a pleasant song. Like, it doesn't stand out too much in any particular way as, like, the greatest or the worst. It's just there and pleasant for the purpose that it serves. The next song is one of the best songs on the album. Like, this and Quiet Town are probably the 2 best, and they just happen to be the ones that they picked to, like, feature most predominantly, because Runaway Horses, the next song, is what they played live on, I want to say it was Jimmy Kimmel or Fallon, I don't remember which one. It was one of the Jimmy Tonight Show guys, and Quiet Town's the one that they have, like, a single with a music video to. Runaway Horses features a duet with Phoebe Bridgers, and, like, Brandon's vocals are beautiful both with the harmony with her and without it, and singing alone, and there's, like, a delicate melody. It's a very, very beautiful song. Like, I mean, it's hard to come up with other adjectives. It's very just pleasant and charming and thoughtful And it's being about a small town girl. It's very relatable if you have been one or knew this girl. Like the idea of, wedding invitations from a barn outside of town. I think everybody's received that wedding invitation at some point in their life by now. At least if you live rurally or have friends who do. Everybody's gotten that wedding invitation at some point. And in a way, the song's content, it's like if West Hills was a slowed down, microscoped version of Uncle Johnny, then this is a slowed down, microscoped version of Miss Atomic Bomb. To me, at least, that's how it felt. And in the next song, In the Car Outside, it took a couple listens for me to appreciate this song, but it feels like a classic early album Killers song. Like, it feels like something off of Day and Age, musically, which, like, I love that album. It's just, Day and Age doesn't quite fit on Pressure Machine, so I was like, this doesn't vibe. But upon re-listening, I'm like, if I just take this as a Killer song, it's a pretty solid Killer song. But, it's a little different than the other tracks on the song, as in it's more of a standard, usual synth-heavy Killers kind of song. And so, like I said, musically it fits, like, with Day and Age, and lyrically it fits with Battleborn. There's parts of it that are reminiscent of Runaways and Just a Matter of Time. So it's sort of a mashup of some classic Killers song elements rolled into this song. And I gotta say, it's the best song for evoking a locomotive vibe with the music since at least Train Kept A-Rollin'. Like, there's parts of the melody that sound like the train bells when you're at a crossing. There's a fast chugging rhythm to it, like, a high-speed train would be having. Like, the whole thing evokes a locomotive so strongly. Like, it is such a train song. And I thought that was very clever and well done. And that kind of thing, that sort of nuance to a song where it's not overt, but when you listen for it, you're like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere in this song. Is very well done on the arranging and, music writing side of things for this album. And extraordinary to find that much thought and craft put into music that's, modern and popular. So I was impressed. And I mean, and they mentioned a train a couple times in the lyrics, so, like, once you put together the puzzle pieces, you're like, oh my gosh, this whole thing is a train. Like, this whole song is a train, even though it's about the car outside. And so I thought that was really cool. Now, In Another Life, is lyrically engaging, but musically it's weak to me. Like, not every song on an album can be good, and some other people may listen to In Another Life and enjoy it. Like, it does pose some, sort of philosophical questions about, like, well, what if my life had been different? And I appreciate that, because it sort of got me thinking, like, well, what would my life have been like had I finished high school in my hometown? Would I be married? Would I be doing this? Would I have the aspirations and goals? I wouldn't have met friends that I've made since then. So, philosophically, the lyrics are solid, but musically it's kind of weak, in to me at least. Which, like I said, not every song on an album can be stand out. Otherwise, none of them would stand out. And this one sort of falls short of the rest. Now, the next song, Desperate Things, I am here to say, as much as I don't like to draw comparisons between previous and artists, this is the single most Springsteen song that the Killers have ever done out of any of their albums, and they're notorious for name-dropping and drawing inspiration from Springsteen. Like, everybody knows they're huge fans of the boss, and, I mean, who isn't? But it's so Springsteenian, Bruceian, whatever you want to call it. It's literally like a combination of Highway Patrolman from Nebraska and Highway 29 from the Ghost of Tom Joad album. It's the two of those. So you've got like the moral and ethical dilemmas. You have the main character being a police officer, like he is in Highway Patrolman. And you've got the aspects of ethics and affairs and who when is something wrong and when is something right, like the challenges to a person's moral compass that are in both Highway Patrolman and Highway 29, you know, where Highway 29 he's having an affair, which is a shared theme in this song. And Highway Patrolman, it's like, when is it okay to not do your job correctly? Which there's sort of an inference that he, in Desperate Things, that maybe he takes his police force authority a little too strongly on a guy who's been abusing his girlfriend. Like, is it justified? Yes. Is it acceptable when that is your job? That is the question. So, there's some challenging moral compass issues. So like I said, it's very much a Springsteen type song. And even musically, it kind of feels like something Bruce could have done. So this is the single most Bruceian song that the Killers have done. And I love it. Like, that is not an insult to it. That is a compliment. Being compared to Bruce Springsteen, it's like being compared to Bob Dylan or Johnny Cash. It's high praise. I'm not saying they're not original, because it is very original. But it very bears the marks of their inspiration from Bruce, and that is no shame. It ain't no sin. And then the next song is Pressure Machine, which is another song like Runaway Horses, where you've got some really delicate, beautiful, soft singing by Brandon, and some very lovely fingerpicking on guitar. And the lyrics are filled, they're very nostalgic. They reference, you know, things like Power Wheels and Happy Meals and things like that. Like, they're very reminiscent of childhood and nostalgia, which if you grew up anywhere, but especially in a small town, like, you can see these things and remember them very strongly. To me, it sounds strange, but it feels like watching Toy Story. I don't know how else to put it, and I don't know how to explain why I feel that way about it, but it feels like it should be playing in a scene during one of the Toy Story films. Like, it feels like Toy Story, and that's the best way I can put it. Maybe it's the childhood references and soft acoustic guitar, but it feels like a Toy Story song, or it feels like watching Toy Story makes me feel. So, Pressure Machine is the Toy Story song. And don't ask me to really explain that, that's just what it evokes in me. And then the final song, The Getting By, is a perfect way to end the album. It's a really tender view of, like, the daily grind of living. There's, yet again, harmonica. Like, who would have knew that the Killers would be using harmonica and mandolins all over the place in this album, and steel guitar and cellos and everything. And it's sort of like, you know, examining, like, yeah, there's the daily grind, but maybe the real purpose of life is sort of in that, like, it's the struggle of daily living, and, you know, life's meant to be lived in today, not the nostalgic past of songs like Pressure Machine, and not the uncertain future of, like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of this small town, or, you know, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, or, you know, the things that you get caught up and lost in, but just the day-to-day doing a job well done might just be one of the most important things you can do with your life kind of perspective, which makes it a good sort of taking things out of the past and out of philosophizing, like the other songs do, and into the here and now, and what that looks like. and that perspective on things. So that's the last song, so that will be the last of this ramble. I hope you enjoyed. Definitely go listen to the album. I hope I've at least piqued your interest, and I hope I didn't bore you either. But go give the album a listen if you haven't listened to the rest of the Killers catalog, and this is your first time really hearing about them. Go definitely look into the rest of their stuff. My recommendations would be, everybody talks about Hot Fuzz because it was their first album, I think. But my recommendations are honestly Battleborn and Day and Age. But all of their albums are good. I can't think of one that I really dislike. Sawdust is like a bunch of outtakes and unreleased stuff, and it's a little different. Like, it's the one I know the least well, so I like it the least, but it's still got some good songs on it. So, yeah, go check out the Killers, and go check out some other songs, and maybe let me know about some artists that, you know, are new, that are still musically of high quality, because I would love to find out about other new bands, because, like I said, the Killers are about the only modern band that I like and respect. Excuse me. And I will be back next week with most likely, definitely back in the oldies where my heart resides. And we'll be sharing fun factoids about obscure artists or Bruce Springsteen or one of my usual things. But it was fun to be in the present and have some positive new music to talk about. So go check it out. Subscribe if you want to. Check out my Instagram and my Facebook. I will be getting into making these episodes available as a podcast through Spotify probably at some point. I have to sort of work out the technicality of that and figure it out, but hopefully that will be happening soon, and I will keep y'all posted on all that. Have a wonderful week. Be kind to each other, and rock on, and see you next week. In this quiet